Hello everybody, this is International Master Sam Shankland, and today I would like to continue my series on the Ruy Lopez opening, which I started off by looking at some variations in the classical Ruy Lopez kind of structures and sort of the more different structures like the Berlin and the Open Ruy, and maybe the Exchange Ruy and various other things. But today I'm actually going to take a look into a game played by two super grandmasters, Judith Polgar and Alexander Morozevich, where that was, I think, a really good example of how to play the Ruy Lopez, especially from Alexander Morozevich playing the black pieces, who won the game in quite convincing style. And so without further ado, let's get to the game. So it starts out e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, so on, just as the Ruy Lopez always does. And now a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castle, bishop e7, rook e1, b5, bishop b3. And now Morozevich played a sort of a trickier move order with d6. So by playing d6, he's foregone any possibility of playing the Marshall attack, which would, just to remind people, goes castles, c3, and now a quick d5 from black with good compensation and often good chances to make a draw, especially at top levels. But after d6, he's completely foregone this. However, there's some tricky ideas. For example, now if white just tries to play c3 and d4, then black will counter with bishop g4 and have some pressure on the center. This is not such a huge deal. It's not a big problem for white, but it's something to keep in mind about move orders. So what white often wants to do after d6 is to prevent bishop g4 by playing h3. However, h3 in this position would be a mistake, because now after knight a5, the white bishop can't go anywhere. Notice that if black had played knight a5 straight up right now, then he would just lose his e5 pawn, and it's okay for white to be giving up the bishop here because he's winning a pawn. But after d6, the sort of, well, it's not exactly like a winning threat, but what black wants to play is knight a5, so what white should play c3. However, bishop g4 is not really effective unless white has already played d4, otherwise it's not really pressuring anything, because if white plays something like, let's say, d3 here, why is the bishop so great? White might play knight d2, knight f1, h3, and start playing knight g3 and kicking the bishop around, while black doesn't have any immediate tension in the center to try to make justify bishop g4. So black castles. And now white would really like to play d4, but if you play d4 again, then bishop g4 will be a strong move. So here white plays h3. I think we've probably gone over most of this in the previous videos. This part is sort of just jogging your memory. So bishop b7. So Morozevich has decided what system he wants to play. He's going to sort of play like a Bray or Chigorin type setup. And the game continues d4, rook e8, knight bd2, bishop f8. So notice that what white really would like to do is play moves like knight f1, knight g3, but white plays knight f1 now, he might run into some issues because black can take on d4 and then grab this pawn, because white will not be able to defend it. So white kind of would like to play bishop c2. This opens up other possibilities. For example, e takes d4, c takes d4, knight b4, threatening to grab the bishop pair, and this bishop is always a valuable piece, and then bishop b1, c5, striking back in the center. And after, let's say, d5 is a possibility, we would often get a sort of Benoni-like structure. Black probably has to play a5 here, or else his knight will be trapped. But it's a very interesting position. There's also many other possibilities. But in the game, Polgar plays a4, which is a good move. It creates tension on the other side of the board. If there's tension all over the place, oftentimes the side with more space will be at an advantage, and in this case that's white, although I don't think white can claim any edge just yet. So Morozevich plays knight a5, poking the bishop, and uncovering more attackers on this pawn. So if white plays bishop a2, for example, then e takes d4 will be very strong because this pawn is going to fall. But bishop c2 is played. And now Morozevich came up with a very interesting, and in my opinion, very strong move, b4. In this kind of structure, I think White often is going to play on the king side with moves like knight to f1, g4, knight g3, and start to attack, and black's going to play on the queen side. And if black can play b4 and open the b file very quickly, it should be to his advantage. For example, here, white can't really take this pawn because after knight c6, the pawn is unprotectable. And if b5, we just take it, and again, it is not takeable because of this pin on the rook. And also, black is now putting tension in the center on this d4 pawn. For example, if white plays d5, knight takes b4, bishop b1, well, now black has traded his b pawn for white's c pawn, a side pawn for a center pawn, and he's got the b4 square for his knight, which cannot be kicked because white lacks a c pawn. And here black plays, let's say, c6, chipping away at the center, and I think can be confident of having some advantage already. So it is in white's best interest not to take this pawn on b4. So white makes a committal but not necessarily bad move and plays d5. So now c takes b4 is a legitimate threat. Black has to deal with that right away. But the center is being closed, and I think that in this case the central tension was favoring black. If you look, it's hard to find like a way for white to continue his plan, or in this case her plan, without sort of allowing black to make trouble for her in the center. For example, knight f1 is sort of what white wants to play, but now this e4 pawn again becomes weak because the bishop, the knight, and then soon the rook will be able to attack. So I think that it's sort of in white's interest to lock the center because black can play useful moves anyway. Moves like g6, bishop g7. The central tension will not prevent him from doing that. So after d5, ꞋMorozovich's hand is forced. He has to take on c3. And then he uncorks another standard Ruy Lopez theme in these kind of close positions, is while white has just grabbed more central space, he sort of attacks this center with c6. So right away, white is put to the test. What should he do about the center? Or, I'm sorry, what should she do about the center? Should they take on c6? Well, probably not, because that would let black take back and prepare for d5 with more central breaks. The c3 pawn is now weak, and black's knight on a5, which was looking kind of silly, is now ready to get back in the game. It's protecting e5 and therefore supporting the d5 push. So, after c6, white played c4 with the intention of, okay, if c takes d5, c takes d5, big deal. Same structure, I have more space on the queen side, and black's got some weaknesses there for me to attack with open b file and open c file. And I think if this were played, then white would probably have some advantage, but Morozevich maintained the tension for a little bit. Queen to c7. Just anticipating someday opening up the c file, putting the queen on this square is probably going to be to his advantage. Notice that white can't ever really break the tension with a move like d takes c6, because after, again, just taking back, we have the same problem. This structure is very bad for white because this weak c4 pawn and weak squares on d4 and b4 and c5. Black will easily be able to play moves like knight d7 to c5 and definitely have some advantage. And use the d4 and b4 squares as well and target the c4 pawn. But black, although in this case back here c takes d5 was not favorable, this structure in some cases will be good for him if he can get the right piece alignment. So he will always have that option, but he will never actually have to exercise it. So queen c7, bishop d3. White's protecting the c4 point, which is very natural. Also, in the event of c takes d5, c takes d5, this bishop is now much better placed and can attack the a6 pawn, which will be one of the key weaknesses in black's position. So queen c7, bishop d3, rook eb8. Again, anticipating the queen side being opened up. Black puts his rook on this nice open file, and he's probably looking at the b4 square in particular, which has lots of targets in mind. This bishop is probably going to reroute to c8. So white continues rook a3, which, quite frankly, I don't quite understand. Probably is thinking of maybe going to c3 to defend because they want to develop their bishop here, but they don't really have a good square to put it on because b2, it's going to be weak when this bishop moves out of the way. For example, take d5, d5, bishop takes d5. And a3 may end up blocking pieces in and being weak in other cases. So I guess rook a3 could be used to put the rook on c3. Although, again, I don't really understand this move too well. I'm not as good as Polgar. So rook a3, bishop c8, knight f1. So white's starting to continue her plan of maybe playing for knight to g3 or g4 and try to attack. Sorry, another point of rook a3, I should say, is to cover the c3 square in case after takes, the queen wants to get into c3. So bishop d7, which is just a good move, you know, rerouting the bishop. Black's been very flexible with his play, and because not too much is going on right now, it's okay for him to play originally bishop b7 and then bishop back to c8 to d7. It served his purpose. He's opened the queen side favorably. Bishop g5. So now white has found a good square for her bishop. If she can take on f6 and force black to take back with the g-pawn, then black will have a lot of weaknesses in his position, most notably the f5 square. For example, if black plays something silly like h6 after bishop f6, gf6, knight g3, white's next moves will play themselves. Moves like knight g4, knight h5, or knight f5, queen g4, or queen h5. There's lots of good attacking moves, and black king will definitely come under some serious pressure because his kingside pawn structure has been crippled. So black plays bishop to e7. Note how black earlier played bishop f8, now plays bishop back to e7. This is sort of characteristic of the Ruy Lopez. The character of the position is capable of changing drastically over the course of just a few moves, and it's okay to, you know, bring your bishop back where it was because it's a better square, because not too much is going to go on. You're not just going to get checkmated really quickly. You're not going to get brutalized by an attack. It's not such a big deal to make, I guess, like, you might want to call them, I wouldn't call them useless moves or waste of time, but, you know, it's not going to cost you as much. And if you think it's better on this square now that the pawn structure has changed, or the position has somehow changed, it's okay to bring it right back. Knight to e3. So Polgar has the idea of dropping a knight into d5 at some point, possibly trying to force matters on her own by playing dc6, bishop c6, knight d5, and forcing black to take the knight on d5. For example, if black takes d5 here, white takes back, let's say. This isn't optimal play, of course, but this is a structure that likely might turn out quite well for white. So Polgar might have in mind something like if black plays like g6 for some reason, something like takes, and now knight d5, thinking the only black can't possibly stand this knight on d5, he'll have to take, or taking on d5, we get the same structure as we saw before. And this is very strong, enterprising play by Polgar. Morozevich plays h6, putting immediate question to this bishop. So also another point of knight e3 is to look at the f5 square. Maybe white wants to play knight h4, queen f3, and start to attack things with knight f5. And after the move h6, forces white to commit the bishop. If white plays bishop h4, then knight h4 is just never going to happen. And white doesn't necessarily want to play bishop takes f6 so soon either. So white played bishop h4, and now black took on d5. So I think in this case, it turns out that this structure will be good for black, because after a move like c takes d5, rook to b4, this dark squared bishop is out of play. The dark square bishop went on a sally over to the king side, where it doesn't seem to be doing that much, when if it were placed on d2, for example, it would be much more effective at keeping the black pieces out of the white position. In this case, white has a weak a4 pawn, black is in control of all the open files, and I think black can be confident of some advantage. So, in the game, white played bishop takes f6, knight takes d5. So as we saw before, this structure is just terrible for white. His pawn structure yields many holes in the position that sort of resemble Swiss cheese. But she does get a very powerful knight on d5. However, after queen d8, what now? The knight is extremely pretty, but maybe not too effective. And in the meantime, this is almost like a Sveshnikov theme, like dealing with the knight on d5, except a Sveshnikov up a lot of tempos with a lot of other pluses. Black, I think, has an advantage now. One plan black has is to say, okay, your knight on d5 is good, but my knight is going to go to c5, and it's going to be even better than yours. So after queen d8, white played knight d2, trying to shore up all weaknesses. Maybe I have ideas of playing f4 or knight f1 to support this knight some more. Black plays bishop g5, just getting out of the way of any potential tries to trade off this bishop and quickly attack the pawn on d6. So now, knight back to f3. Polgar, no doubt, would be happy with a draw here, but Morozevich realizes that his position is advantageous, so he does not comply. He plays knight to b7. He's not worried about this knight taking the bishop, because he's happy if he can... Basically, he wants to trade this knight on d5 for his light squared bishop, and then use the dark squares with his knight, And if white ends up with just this bishop on d3 against the knight on b7, she'll be in bad shape. So a5. This is an interesting move. If black could have played a5 and then dropped in knight c5, it's very likely this a pawn would be in serious trouble. So while a5 looks like it just loses a pawn, I think after closer examination, moves like queen a1, it's going to be clear that white will have some compensation and the a pawn will be a bit slow. Also, white can probably try to play c5 and blast open the center, and if dc5, knight e5, white definitely is going to have some compensation for a pawn. But Morozevich doesn't play in such a rash way. He plays it a little more solidly. He just plays bishop to e6. Very simple plan, remove this knight on d5. And then after c takes, play knight to c5, use the b file, try to take this pawn on a5 eventually. So Polgar plays knight takes g5. This is an extremely committal move, and I must say I'm not a fan of it. However, I think her position was already in trouble. For example, after something like, let's say, bishop to c2, bishop takes d5, there's no really good way to recapture on d5. If you take back with the queen, then there's always going to be permanent weaknesses. The c5 square is weak, the a5 pawn is weak, the c4 pawn is weak, and it's hard to see what white is really going to do. And if you take back with the e-pawn, then black can firmly block white's queenside majority with knight to c5, and then slowly but surely start to advance in the kingside in the center with f5 and e4. Although this can't happen right away, obviously, because of white's bishop, eventually it will. And after e takes d5, knight to c5, eventually this knight on c5 is very strong, and it's hard to see how if white can trade his knight for it. And in the meantime, the knight on c5 protects the pawn on a6, and it's hard to, white can't really generate counterplay there, and eventually it's quite likely black will be able to win this pawn because the dark squared bishop can attack it and the light squared bishop cannot defend it. So Polgar plays knight takes g5, which is committal, but I'm not a fan, but she is a better player than me. She does have her own ideas. So Morozevich took back with the pawn, most likely because he was worried about taking with the queen knight to c7 and maybe making some annoyances in his position after, let's say, rook to a7, rook to b3, with some pins and making the position quite bothersome to play. For example, something like rook c8, knight e6, fe6, and now white's starting to get some play with moves like rook b6, eyeing this pawn and this pawn. But there's just no need to allow this. H takes g5 is a perfectly acceptable move. Also, it gives black a very long-term plan of playing something like g6, king g7, putting a rook on the h file, and then sometime dropping down g4. And this was possible to play like g5, g4 because of these doubled pawns. Black still has a g-pawn in front of his king. So, queen d2, and now Morozevich takes the knight and plays knight to c5. So, basically the maneuvering stage of the game is now over. Morozevich was essentially the victor of this part of the game. He has now ended up with an excellent knight against a poor bishop. White has a weak pawn on a5 that will always need defense, while this great knight will always defend the a6 pawn and it will never be able to be removed. And Morozevich has ideas of playing on the king side as well. However, the game is definitely not over yet. There's still much more fighting to be done. So, bishop to f1, rook to b3. Morozevich realizes the closer he can get to an endgame with less pieces, where he has this excellent knight against this bad bishop, the better off he will be. Rook takes, knight takes, queen e3, knight c5. And now, basically, there's only two open files, the b file and the c file. And the h file for black has the potential to open sometime. But what's important to notice is that the c file will never be useful for white because this knight blocks it, and it looks like black will be the first one to get to the b file because white has to waste time defending this pawn on a5. So, queen d2, rook b8, black now takes the b file and has all the play. White has to sit and defend passively and hope that her position holds together somehow. Bishop to c4, queen to f6. Morozevich is probably thinking along the lines of queen to f4 at some point, with the ideas then of playing moves like rook to b4 and something like rook a4, rook takes a5. So queen to c2, g6. Excellent move by Morozevich. He wants to play king to g7, rook to h8, and start to really attack. And he can do this because he can improve his position slowly but surely, because white is basically completely paralyzed and can do nothing to stop black's progress. So one key moment here is white has the option of playing rook to b1. And I think it's an interesting one, but objectively speaking, probably not correct, because black will take on b1, and then after queen takes b1, queen to f4, attacking this pawn on e4, which is actually very hard to defend. And she really has to defend it. If like queen b6 trying to make counterplay, queen takes e4, hits the bishop, and if bishop a6, queen d5, black's going to win a pawn and have a big center, and likely have a winning advantage. And if white does try to defend this with a move like bishop to d3, well then black plays queen d2, forking the bishop and the pawn on a5, winning the pawn. And if f3, then among other things queen d2 again, forking the pawn on a5 and another fork on d4 with the king and the bishop, and white's position is completely falling apart. White's best option might be to play something like queen a2, but then that just concedes the b file right back. Black might play something like queen b4 and can take his sweet time in trying to prosecute his advantage. So white can't really contest the open b file, even though the black queen is seemingly a bit offside. Another possibility for black after rook b1 is, if he didn't find the other ones appealing, just queen to d8, where he's threatening this pawn on a5. And white can't just defend it with queen a2 because black will take and then play queen takes a5. So he has to play rook takes b8 or concede the b file, and they're basically the same thing. Black ends up in control of the open file. So either of those situations would probably be very good for black. So white plays rook to e3, probably with ideas of rook to f3 and trying to make play on the f file. King to g7. Black says, okay, big deal. Congratulations, you played rook to e3. You can play rook to f3. I don't care. Bishop to f1. Just trying, good defensive move, trying to hold together. Queen d8, bringing the queen back and attacking this pawn on a5. And it's starting to look like black's position is really starting to break through. So, rook to a3, rook to b4, attacking this pawn. White's really falling apart now. Bishop c4, queen b8. Black has now doubled his pieces on the b file and is likely to end up with a huge advantage very shortly. White played rook to e3, lending more support to this pawn now that the rook is no longer tied to the defense of a5. And I'm going to end part 1 of this video here. If you can think to yourself, how would you continue with black here to try to get an advantage? Because this is where Morozevich turned the game from a maneuvering battle into a winning position, and he actually won technically. Because at this point, while beforehand he was outmaneuvering Polgar, improving his position, here he has a way to make it so his position is actually winning. So I'll let you guys think about that until the next video comes off. Thanks. This is Sam Shankland.